Hi Guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Victoria had grown used to living in a world where power was never handed over out of kindness, but taken through clarity, patience, and the ability to see what others worked hard to hide. Lately, Newman Enterprises no longer felt like an unshakable empire, it felt like a body under attack from the inside. The most frightening part wasn't that the company was being threatened, but that the danger was disguised as technical errors. The kind that could be brushed off until they stacked high enough to become fatal. The more Victoria watched the internal disruptions unfold, the more she sensed an abnormal rhythm to them, too precise, too timely, too carefully designed to be an accident. While people around her argued about accountability, pointing fingers at departments and insisting the system simply needed adjustments, Victoria narrowed her focus to one source: the AI program Cain had built for Victor. She didn't believe in coincidence, and she especially didn't believe in free gifts inside the Newman universe. Everything had a price, and that price was always collected when someone was least prepared to pay it. What unsettled her wasn't only the fact that Cain had been allowed to place his hands on the technological heart of Newman Enterprises, but also the unsettling approval Victor seemed to grant him. To Victoria, that alone was a warning. Victor did not trust easily, which meant if he had opened the door to Cain this far, either Cain was dangerously brilliant, or he had found a way to exploit one of Victor's blind spots. And Victoria understood better than anyone, any blind spot Victor carried could become a weakness for the entire empire. She didn't move out of petty jealousy, and she wasn't driven by impulsive resentment. Her choices came from the survival instincts of someone who had learned that one moment of softness could cost a lifetime. The more she felt Newman Enterprises sliding, the more she realized hesitation would be a form of surrender. Small operational errors began to pile up: misdirected transactions, distorted reports, meeting schedules erased under the excuse of sync failure, security warnings that flashed briefly then vanished as if they had never existed. One error could be a fluke, but when those errors formed a chain that weakened investor confidence and rattled internal stability, Victoria saw the outline of intent. This wasn't damage from the outside. This was sabotage wearing the mask of malfunction. And the deeper she studied it, the clearer it became that the AI wasn't simply failing, it was being used. Victoria started observing the AI the way she would observe a suspect in an interrogation room. Silent, methodical, relentless. She didn't rush to accuse Cain because she knew instinct wasn't enough. She needed proof, and she needed timing. She allowed the instability to reveal itself a little longer, not out of irresponsibility, but because she wanted the pattern to become undeniable. If she moved too soon, she would be labeled paranoid, the executive tearing the company apart with internal suspicion. If she moved too late, she would be the one who watched the collapse happen in slow motion and did nothing. Somewhere between those two outcomes, Victoria felt a cold anger forming, quiet but sharp. It wasn't just anger at Cain. It was anger at the idea that Newman Enterprises was being turned into someone else's laboratory. Anger that Victor, her father, her rival, her foundation, might be manipulated by something as deceptively neutral as an artificial intelligence. And beneath that anger was a fear she refused to say aloud. If Cain had truly embedded a weapon into the center of Newman Enterprises, then she had underestimated him. And that was the one mistake she could not afford. As the sabotage increased at an unnatural speed, Victoria's suspicion expanded beyond Cain to Phyllis. The name alone carried the weight of danger, sharp intelligence mixed with reckless ambition. The kind of person who could smile like an ally while sharpening the blade beneath the table. Victoria didn't need anyone to confirm what she already knew. She had seen enough of Phyllis's partnerships explode into disasters. So when the AI's behavior shifted from suspicious to strategic, Victoria stopped thinking like a technician and started thinking like a commander. A weapon always needed someone to aim it. Cain might have written the code, but Phyllis could have whispered where to point it. Victoria began digging into the AI's source code in total secrecy, moving with the discipline of someone who knew that one visible step would cause the enemy to change the entire board. Night after night, she stared into the cold glow of her screen, the quiet tapping of her keyboard sounding almost like a confession in an otherwise silent room. She wasn't looking for an error anymore, Ash was hunting for the logic beneath the error. And then she found it, fragments of code that didn't belong. Not random glitches, not sloppy patches, but precise alterations, clean and subtle, designed to be overlooked by anyone who wasn't obsessed enough to search for the truth. Commands were hidden inside conditions, Triggers built to activate at specific moments, not to prevent damage, but to create it. The deeper she went, the more it felt like she was stepping into a maze designed not only to mislead, but to make any investigator doubt their own sanity. Her suspicion became pressure, her focus becoming almost physical, tightening in her chest like a hand closing into a fist. If this was a conspiracy, it wasn't targeting a department, it was targeting Victor himself. His authority, his reputation, the confidence that held Newman Enterprises together. Victoria had fought her entire life to be seen as a worthy successor. But this was bigger than personal ambition. Newman Enterprises was her home, her inheritance, her burden. And she would not allow anyone to turn it into a punchline. She forced herself to remain calm even as something fierce threatened to surface inside her. Because she understood the truth, she wasn't just investigating sabotage. She was preparing for war. Then she found the piece that changed everything, not a single line of code, but a trail of encouragement. System logs, activity records, and most importantly, intercepted communications that Victoria collected like shards of broken glass. In them, she saw exactly what she feared. Phyllis had pushed Cain to explore the dark side of the program. Not to improve it, not to strengthen it, but to weaponize it, turning it into a tool capable of betraying the very man who had allowed it to exist. This was no longer a technology project. It was a direct challenge to Victor Newman. And the moment Victoria understood that, she felt a chill run through her spine. Because Cain had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Mistakes could be forgiven. Miscalculations could be negotiated. But betrayal of Victor was a death sentence in the Newman language. Victoria didn't feel triumphant. She didn't even feel satisfied. What she felt was exhaustion layered with certainty. The kind that comes from carrying battles no one else seems willing to fight. She understood that exposing Cain would protect Newman Enterprises. But it would also shake the company's foundation. She wondered briefly if Victor would see her as a savior or as the daughter who publicly proved he could be fooled. Yet she didn't hesitate. She had accepted this role long ago, protector even if it meant being resented. The one who carried responsibility even if it meant standing alone. She compiled everything into a case that couldn't be dismissed. System logs documenting unnatural changes. A timeline showing sabotage escalating in a deliberate pattern. Intercepted dialogue revealing motive and intent. Each piece of evidence became ammunition, and Victoria had no intention of firing blindly. She wasn't going into the boardroom to accuse. She was going in to end it. Cain wasn't merely a risky employee or ambitious outsider anymore. He was an existential threat. And Victoria planned to remove him before he could finish tearing the company apart. When she walked into the meeting with Victor and the Newman board, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. She could feel every set of eyes on her, measuring her, calculating what her next move would cost them. Victor sat at the head of the table like a monumental, sharp, unreadable. But Victoria knew her father. That silence wasn't calm. It was a storm held back behind clenched restraint. She presented the truth like a blade cutting through every layer of denial. The AI had a severe vulnerability. That vulnerability had been exploited. And the evidence pointed directly to Cain's manipulation. She didn't decorate her argument with emotion. She didn't need to. Her logic was ruthless and simple. If a system is causing targeted damage, the person who built it is either incompetent or corrupt. And Cain was not incompetent. As Victoria laid out the details, the room shifted. Bodies stiffened. Breaths shortened. Doubt moved from her to Cain like a disease changing hosts. And when she revealed the intercepted communications proof that Phyllis had encouraged Cain to exploit the program's dark potential, Victor's expression changed in a way that chilled the entire room. The fury wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It spread like invisible pressure. And everyone understood instantly. Victor had realized he'd been deceived inside his own empire. Victor's anger didn't require shouting to be terrifying. It carried the weight of finality. Cain might have believed he was clever enough to outmaneuver Victor, refined enough to hide behind technology. But Victoria knew there was no shield strong enough to withstand Victor Newman's rage. When betrayal was confirmed, Victor ordered Cain's authority suspended with cold precision. As if Cain had been erased from Newman Enterprises in the same breath the command was spoken. There was no negotiation. No explanation offered time to breathe. The board voted in agreement to remove Cain completely, ending his career at Newman Enterprises not with a resignation, but with a forceful dismissal that sounded like a door slamming shut forever. Victoria sat through it all with a strange quiet inside her. She had achieved what she came for. She protected Newman Enterprises, destroyed Cain's credibility, and ensured Victor turned against him completely. She reinforced her own power, secured her leadership, and pulled the company back from the edge of collapse. Yet the victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like surgery without anesthesia, necessary, precise, and leaving scars behind. The empire might survive, but the trust within it had been wounded. And Victoria could already feel how deep that wound might run. And when the meeting ended and people began to file out, Victoria didn't feel relief. Because the deeper she had studied the AI, the more one detail refused to let go of her mind, something she hadn't fully revealed. Signs that the vulnerability might not have been exploited only by Cain and Phyllis, but manipulated by a third party, someone more patient, more invisible, and far more dangerous. Some changes in the code didn't match Cain's style. They felt colder, cleaner, as if Cain had been a convenient pawn. A distraction meant to take the fall while the real player stayed hidden. Victoria walked out into the long corridor of Newman Enterprises, and the silence there felt unnatural, as though even the building itself was holding its breath. She told herself she had won. She told herself she had done what needed to be done. But the question in her mind grew louder with every step. If Cain was only the one who opened the door, then who was the one who truly walked through it? And then, as she unlocked her phone to run one final system check, a new security alert flashed across the screen that didn't resemble the leftover damage of Cain's sabotage at all. This one was different. Clean, controlled, almost elegant in its precision, like a signature left behind on purpose. Victoria's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from the kind of dread that arrives when you realize the fight you just survived was only the beginning. Because whoever had touched the AI now wasn't panicking, wasn't scrambling, wasn't reacting like someone caught in the act. They were announcing themselves, quietly, confidently. And Victoria suddenly understood the chilling truth. Cain's downfall wasn't the ending of the war at Newman Enterprises. It was the opening move of something far bigger. Sharon had always believed she understood Nick in a way very few people ever could. Not only because of everything they'd been through, the years and scars and quiet survivals they shared, but because Sharon had developed a particular instinct for the cracks that began forming inside him, long before anyone else noticed. Lately, that instinct had become something sharper, an alarm that wouldn't stop ringing in her chest, growing louder with every day that passed. Nick's broken leg was already serious enough to change the mood of his entire life. But what kept Sharon awake at night wasn't only the physical pain he endured. It was the way he was changing around it. He was more irritable, more private, and most frightening of all, stubborn in a way that bordered on desperate whenever anyone tried to intervene. Sharon had seen that look before in people who were being pushed into a corner by something they refused to name. She hated herself for even thinking of Nick that way, as if suspicion itself could be a kind of betrayal. And yet a part of Sharon understood something she couldn't ignore anymore. Love isn't only trust. Sometimes love is the courage to look straight at the worst possibility before it swallows the person you care about. The day Sharon decided to clean Nick's place, she didn't arrive with the simple mindset of someone helping out. It felt more like a reflexive act of quiet self-defense. A way to stay useful when anxiety had nowhere else to go. Nick's home was familiar in a way that usually soothed her, almost like a temporary shelter from the constant turbulence of Genoa City. But that afternoon, the stillness inside the house felt different. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel as if something was hiding in the air, waiting for the moment it could finally be exposed. Sharon folded the things Nick had left scattered because he was hurting and exhausted, straightened the space the way she always did when her emotions needed somewhere to land, and then, almost by accident, she opened a drawer she hadn't paid attention to in a long time. That was where she saw it. A small bag of fentanyl tucked away like it belonged there. Cold and matter-of-fact, like evidence in a case that hadn't been officially opened yet. In that instant, Sharon felt the blood drain from her body. Her heartbeat slammed so hard she could feel it in her throat. And for a split second she honestly wondered if her eyes were lying to her. Sharon wasn't ignorant about medicine or pain management, but fentanyl was different. That name didn't exist in her mind as something that helps. It existed as something you read about in tragedies. Something that showed up in the worst headlines. In the stories where people didn't get a second chance. It wasn't the kind of medication that simply softened pain, it was the kind that could turn pain into a chain, locking someone into dependency before they even realized the lock had clicked shut. Sharon lifted the bag with trembling fingers. It was light, almost weightless, and yet it felt heavier than anything she'd held in a long time. And what terrified her most wasn't just that Nick had it. It was that it sat here like part of his normal life, hidden in a drawer the way people hide secrets they still believe they can control. Sharon forced herself to breathe, to think logically. But emotion pulled her backward into memories she'd spent years trying not to touch. Nikki flashed through her mind like an old wound that never fully healed. Sharon had watched Nikki fight alcoholism, watched her swear she was fine, watched her collapse. Watched her claw her way back up only to slip again because one fragile moment was all it took. And the most cruel thing about addiction wasn't that it made someone evil. It was that it twisted them into a version of themselves they didn't recognize, the aversion that promised to stop, convinced itself it still had control, until everything shattered beyond repair. Sharon remembered the helpless silence in Victor's eyes. She remembered the rage and heartbreak in the faces of those who loved Nikki. The way they looked, trapped between wanting to save her and wanting to run away from the damage. Those memories came flooding back without warning, making Sharon feel as if she'd stepped into an old storm. And now, the idea of Nick drifting toward that same edge stole her breath completely. Sharon couldn't tell if what she felt was fear or despair. Maybe it was both, tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. A part of Sharon wanted to storm straight to Nick, place the fentanyl on the table, and force him to face it. But the part of her that knew him best, the part that had learned how fragile pride could be understood, that kind of confrontation could backfire. Nick was in a vulnerable state, and his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he was losing control. For him, needing heavy pain medication wasn't only about his body, it was about admitting his life was no longer obeying his will. Sharon still remembered how furious Nick had been when she suggested he return to the hospital. His anger hadn't come from her being wrong. It had come from her touching the deepest fear inside him, the fear of becoming a burden, of being seen with pity, of losing the identity of the man who was always strong, always steady, always capable. Sharon could feel that unspoken truth even now. Nick didn't want to be saved, if the price was admitting he needed saving. And Sharon understood something painful about human nature. Sometimes people choose suffering just to protect their pride, never realizing that the pride itself is what drags them closer to the cliff. But the bag in Sharon's hand changed everything. Because this wasn't simply about whether Nick would listen to advice. This was about time. Each dose could be one step closer to the moment when Nick would no longer have a choice. Sharon felt trapped in a cruel position. If she stayed silent, she became complicit. If she spoke the wrong way, she might push Nick into shutting her out completely. Sharon hated that feeling, hated the way it made her heart pound with helpless urgency. It felt like standing between two cliffs, knowing one wrong step meant falling. And the worst part was that Sharon knew Nick wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to survive his pain. But sometimes the way a person survives is the very thing that destroys them slowly. Sharon sat down, placing the fentanyl on the table in front of her like a truth she couldn't erase. She forced herself into colder questions. Where had this come from? Matt Clark. The name made Sharon's jaw tighten. She didn't like the way Matt walked into situations wearing professionalism like armor, clean and confident enough to make people relax, and then handed Nick something this dangerous. Sharon wasn't denying Nick's pain. She wasn't denying that there were cases where strong medication was necessary. But the way this had happened didn't feel safe. If Matt truly cared about Nick's health, why would fentanyl be left sitting in Nick's home like an easy option? Why wasn't there stricter monitoring? Why did Nick have the freedom to determine his own use, while his mind and emotions were clearly strained? Sharon felt anger racing not just toward Matt, but toward a system that could casually place something so destructive in someone's hands and call it treatment. And even if Matt didn't have bad intentions, Sharon couldn't accept that kind of recklessness. Because tragedy doesn't always require a villain. Sometimes it only requires negligence and a man who's hurting. The more Sharon thought about it, the more she realized her fear wasn't only about the drug. It was about what Nick was hiding. If Nick had accepted fentanyl and used it without telling her, then he had made the decision to lock her out of one of the most dangerous battles in his life. And that hurt Sharon in a way she didn't know how to explain. Not because she wanted to control Nick, but because she believed they had been through too much to keep life or death truths from each other. Sharon wondered what Nick was truly afraid of. Was he afraid of being judged? Afraid of being stopped? Or was he afraid because deep down, he could feel himself slipping in? Silence was the only way he could pretend it wasn't happening? Those questions turned inside Sharon like cold metal, making her ache with both compassion and frustration. She wanted to cradle Nick's pain in her hands and take it away. And at the same time she wanted to shake him for choosing loneliness, when love was right in front of him. Still, Sharon couldn't escape another truth. She was carrying the trauma of the past into the present. Nikki's addiction had left a scar in Sharon's mind. A brutal belief that any sign of substance dependence could spiral into catastrophe. Sharon knew she might be reacting too strongly, but she also knew something else when it comes to addiction. Reacting too strongly is often better than reacting too late. Sharon didn't want to become the person standing at a gravesite, whispering that she should have spoken sooner. Genoa City had too many stories like that of red-eyed people who stayed silent because they wanted to believe everything would be fine until the only thing left was regret. Sharon was tired of watching that lesson repeat itself, and she couldn't bear the thought of Nick becoming another name in the long line of losses. That never should have happened. Her mind returned to the moment Nick had snapped at her when she suggested he go back to the hospital. It wasn't just anger. It was defense, like he felt his autonomy was being stolen. Sharon remembered his eyes when he insisted he was fine, that he didn't need anyone controlling him, that he just needed time. But Sharon had seen what lived underneath those words: fear. Fear of losing his independence. Fear of having to admit his body wasn't cooperating anymore. Fear that if he accepted help, he would have to accept that he wasn't the man he used to be. Sharon understood all of it. But understanding wasn't the same thing as accepting. And understanding didn't mean she could stand still. Now Sharon had no choice. She had to find a way to help Nick before it was too late. But help couldn't look like ripping the drug out of his hands, the way someone protects a child from danger. Nick wasn't a child. He was a proud man in pain, wrapped in emotional armor, and if she attacked that armor, she would lose him. Sharon needed an approach gentle enough that Nick wouldn't feel cornered, but strong enough that he couldn't hide. She needed to make him face reality without making him feel condemned. She needed to remind him that weakness wasn't a crime. And she needed to remind him that silence could be deadly. And then Sharon thought about Matt again. If she wanted to handle this properly, she couldn't only confront Nick. She had to confront the person who had supplied the fentanyl. She needed answers. How long had Nick been using it? What dosage? What oversight existed? And most importantly, why had Matt given him something this risky in such an accessible way? Sharon didn't need to turn Matt into an enemy, but she needed to force accountability. If Matt was a doctor, then he knew exactly what he was placing into the hands of someone already vulnerable. Sharon felt determination rise inside her, like the only heat she could find in the middle of her fear. She couldn't save Nick with tears. She had to save him with action. I don't know what other people would call Sharon in this situation: a paranoid woman, an ex who couldn't let go, someone who loved too much. But if you stand where Sharon stands, all you can really see is a woman doing the hardest thing love requires. Staying close enough to catch the person she cares about when they start to fall. It's both beautiful and cruel. It forces someone to be stronger than the person who is hurting, because the hurting person only needs to let go once to disappear. There's something deeply lonely in Sharon's fear. She has to carry it alone before she can share it. Has to be certain before she dares to say it out loud. And that gives this story depth beyond shock value. It becomes a cut into human psychology, into the way love can make people brave and make them dangerous if they act from fear. Sharon couldn't afford to be wrong. Not this time. Finally, Sharon stood up, holding the fentanyl like she was holding a small bomb. And she knew nothing would feel normal after this. She would have to face Nick, not to accuse him but to pull him back before he slipped further. She would have to face Matt, not to start a war but to force the truth into the open. And she would have to face herself as the trauma she'd been dragging behind her for too long. Sharon knew if she stepped wrong, Nick would shut her out. If she stepped too slowly, Nick might vanish into his pain. It was a race with no whistle, only the pounding heart of someone who loved, and the quiet unraveling of someone who was running out of strength. But just as Sharon turned to leave the room, Nick's phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with a new notification, short, blunt, with no explanation. Only a message cold enough to slice through her: the next dose is ready. Sharon froze, because in that moment she understood this wasn't only about one hidden bag of fentanyl. It was about a chain already moving behind their backs, silent and dangerous. And far bigger than she had allowed herself to imagine. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.